I'm Evelyn Carter. I'm 35, the daughter who was always told she'd never measure up. And tonight, sitting at my mother's table, I realize they still expect me to play the role of the family failure. In this house, Daniel is the golden son 2 homes before 40, praised for every step he takes. I am the one they laugh at, the one whose silence is mistaken for weakness. My mother's smirk sharpens every comparison, and the others nod along as if it were truth. But the game changed years ago. When she stole my tuition fund and handed it to Daniel, she didn't just take my education, she planted the fire that's been burning in me ever since. That betrayal was the day I began writing a new story, one they were never supposed to see. Ever been told to stay in your place? Hit like if someone ever dismissed your worth just because you didn't fit their idea of success. It started with a Thanksgiving dinner, and the words that made everyone laugh but cut straight through me. She'll never buy a house. I sat 2 seats down from her, my fork suspended above the glazed turkey breast on my plate, and let the familiar sting slide across my skin. It wasn't the first time. I had been the family's easiest target for as long as I could remember, the one who could absorb the ridicule without shouting back, the one whose silence only seemed to embolden them. The lights overhead glowed warmly on the polished silverware, on the cranberry sauce in its perfect crystal dish, but under that cozy veneer the air was tense, brittle, waiting for the next jab. Uncle Henry leaned forward, chuckling. She's always been careful with her money. Maybe too careful. Still renting after all these years, right? The tone wasn't cruel. Not exactly. It was the kind of comment that floated just above open derision, the kind that left me no polite way to answer without sounding defensive. Mother raised her glass of wine, her lipstick catching the rim in a dark imprint. Careful? She let the word linger, shaking her head with an indulgent smile. Careful people don't end up with anything. She's 35 and has nothing to show for it. A ripple of agreement moved around the table. Daniel, seated opposite me, seized the moment like a practiced partner in a comedy routine. Banks wouldn't even look at her, he added, voice dripping with easy confidence. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of approval in Mother's eyes rewarding him like a child, praised for parroting the right answer. The weight of a dozen pairs of eyes pressed against me. Some looked pitying, others amused, but none came to my defense. I had been here before. The family gatherings where accomplishments were paraded like trophies and my quiet resilience counted for nothing. I lowered my fork and folded my hands in my lap, focusing on breathing evenly. There was a script in place, and I was expected to play my role, the overlooked daughter, the failure, the lesson in what not to become. They didn't know, couldn't know, what I carried with me tonight. Margaret basked in the attention, tilting her head with mock concern. Really, Evelyn, at your age, do you ever plan to stop throwing money away on rent? Do you imagine some miracle falling into your lap? Her words dangled in the air like bait, but I didn't bite. The chatter resumed, cousins boasting about new kitchens, promotions, interest rates on their mortgages. I let their voices blur into background noise, focusing instead on the thrum of my pulse. Every barb, every dismissive laugh, only deepened the quiet resolve I had been cultivating for years. I shifted slightly in my chair, slipping one hand beneath the tablecloth. My fingers brushed the edge of my leather bag resting at my feet. Smooth, firm, reassuring. I slid my hand inside and felt the weight of the sealed documents tucked within. Crisp edges met my touch, the proof of everything they said I would never have. A small current of heat moved through me, warming me from the inside. Not anger, not exactly. Something sharper, steadier, anticipation. I drew my hand back out and placed it calmly on the table, meeting no one's eyes, keeping my expression neutral. The conversation swelled again, filled with the rustle of cutlery and the self-satisfied tones of people who thought the story of me was already written. They think I'm powerless. Let them. Your tuition fund? I gave it to Daniel. He needed it more. The words fell with the weight of a verdict, and for a moment I didn't even understand them. I was 20 years old, standing in the middle of our family's living room with a folded bank statement in my hand, my pulse pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own voice as I stammered, "What do you mean it's gone?" The room smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. My mother sat in her armchair by the window, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, her posture so composed it seemed impossible that she had just detonated the foundation of my future. She waved one hand, dismissive, as though explaining an overdue utility bill. Daniel had an opportunity, a chance to build something real. Do you think I'd let my son miss that just so you could waste time in classrooms? My throat went dry. That fund wasn't a gift. It was mine, my savings from part-time jobs, my scholarships, contributions my grandfather had set aside for me. Years of careful planning. I had pictured tuition checks, textbooks, lectures. I had pictured possibility. And in a single sentence, it evaporated. Daniel walked in at that moment, 25 and brimming with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing the world bent toward him. He tossed his keys onto the coffee table and grinned. "She's overreacting, Mom. It's just money. I'll double it in 6 months. You'll thank me when it pays off." I turned to him, my voice thin and sharp. "That was my education, my future." He shrugged, picking up a soda can and popping it open. "You'll be fine. You always are. Besides, college isn't everything. Not everyone's cut out for it. You can work, you can save, you'll get by." He didn't even look at me, as if I were background noise, as if my dreams were something laughably small. Mother's expression hardened, lips pressing into a thin smile that carried no apology. "Sacrifices must be made for the family. Daniel is the one with potential. Sometimes you give for the greater good." Her tone suggested I should be proud, as though stripping me of my chance at higher education was some noble contribution. I clutched the bank statement, my hands trembling so badly that the paper crumpled. Numbers stared back at me, zeros where savings had once been. The digits blurred as tears filled my eyes. Daniel sat on the arm of the sofa, launching into his pitch, boasting about investments and market timing, how he'd researched the next big thing. His words flowed fast, brimming with certainty, every sentence a reminder that he had stolen what was mine. I wanted to scream, to demand it back, to force them to see what they'd done. But my voice caught in my throat, smothered under the weight of their confidence and my isolation. If I shouted, they would dismiss it as drama. If I begged, they would call it weakness. So I sat down instead, the statement limp in my lap, tears sliding silently down my cheeks. Daniel kept talking, his promises stacking higher and higher, while my mother nodded approvingly. In their eyes, I was already forgotten. The hours stretched, and when Daniel finally left to meet friends, the living room fell quiet. My mother looked at me once more and said, "You'll survive. You always do." Then she rose, smoothed her skirt, and walked away, leaving me in the silence of my stolen future. I sat there long after the house grew dark, the sound of a clock ticking on the mantelpiece slicing through my thoughts. Rage simmered beneath the grief, a slow-burning ember that refused to die. They had taken everything I had planned for, but I knew something in that moment. If no one else was going to protect my future, I would have to build it myself, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Years later, I still remember the sharp sting of that betrayal more vividly than anything Daniel ever accomplished. His venture collapsed within a year, the money gone, excuses endless. But no one ever asked how I had managed, how I pieced my life back together. They assumed I was simply the one who couldn't measure up. I lift my glass now, in the present, swirling red wine under the soft light of my mother's dining room, the chatter of relatives humming around me. My reflection trembles on the surface of the liquid, eyes darker, wiser than the girl who once sat with a crumpled bank statement in her lap. That was the day I began my real education. "I've been working on something," I began, but Mother's laughter cut me off. The sound was sharp, rehearsed, the kind of laughter meant not to share joy, but to slice clean through the fragile thread of courage I had strung together. We were gathered in the living room after dinner, coffee cups steaming, the rich smell of cinnamon and cream filling the air. Lamps glowed warmly, but I felt a cold spotlight on me. I had waited for this small opening, this moment to speak, to assert that I wasn't the caricature they painted me to be. And before I could finish my sentence, the chance dissolved under the echo of her laugh. "Spare us the imagination, dear," she said, shaking her head with exaggerated amusement. She leaned back in her chair, coffee cup balanced effortlessly in her hand, her gaze sweeping across the room as if seeking agreement. "We've heard these little ideas of yours before. Best not to waste everyone's time." Heat flared across my cheeks. Around me, uncles and aunts shifted, some exchanging knowing smiles, others smirking behind their mugs. Daniel, never one to miss the cue, leaned forward from the sofa, his tone dripping with mock seriousness. "Let me guess she's invented the next big thing? Or maybe she's got a plan to buy a house with monopoly money." He grinned, eyes glinting with the cruel joy of performance. "You should patent that, Ev. Play money real estate." The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't loud at first, but it swelled quickly, catching on like a match dropped into dry leaves. Aunts chuckled into their cups, uncles let out guffaws, and even the cousins, younger but eager to belong, joined the chorus. My words, my careful preparation, the seed of pride I had wanted to share vanished beneath their noise. I swallowed hard, the back of my throat tightening as I forced my lips into a closed smile. I had learned long ago that protesting only fed the spectacle. Still, it burned. I had wanted to tell them about the hours I spent after my day job, the quiet evenings building a side business no one knew about, how every dollar was saved, every choice deliberate. I wanted to show them I was not the failure they believed. But their laughter had already decided the story for me. Daniel leaned back, still smirking. Don't look so grim, Ev. We're just teasing. You know we love you. His words landed like stones, dressed in false affection, the same lines he always used to cover the malice. I lowered my eyes, staring at the dark swirl of coffee in my cup. The laughter still rang in my ears, muffled but inescapable. My body felt small in the armchair, as though I had been folded into invisibility. But my hand, resting against my knee, curled into a fist so tight the nails pressed crescents into my palm. I said nothing. Let them believe they had silenced me again. Let them think I was defeated, that I had nothing worth saying. Their voices filled the room, chatter shifting to mortgages, promotions, and vacation plans, leaving me as little more than a shadow at the edge of the conversation. But inside, beneath the layers of humiliation and anger, a vow formed. A vow born from every sneer, every interruption, every laugh that had crushed my voice before it could fully bloom. I would not forget this moment. One day, when the time was right, they would hear me, and there would be no laughter left to cover their shame. If they won't listen now, they'll have no choice soon. Evelyn, it's Richard. I think you should see something. The voice on the other end of the line pulled me out of my restless evening, the faint patter of rain on the window adding weight to his words. I hadn't heard from Richard Hale in years, not since he left our neighborhood to carve out a career in law. The formality of his tone, coupled with that measured pause before something, tightened a knot low in my stomach. An hour later, I found myself stepping into the Hale and Associates office. The late afternoon drizzle blurred the streets of Boston into streaks of gray, and the lobby smelled faintly of wet coats and paper. Upstairs, Richard's office glowed warmly against the gloom. A brass lamp on his desk threw light across neat stacks of files. He rose when I entered, offering the same steady smile I remembered from our youth, though now his eyes carried the gravity of someone who'd spent years watching lives unravel across courtrooms. It's been a long time, I said, shaking off my umbrella. My voice was careful, as though testing the air. Too long, he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. Then, without ceremony, he placed a thick folder on the desk and slid it toward me. I found something in probate archives, something you were never told. I stared at the folder but didn't touch it. My fingers hovered as though the paper might burn. Richard's gaze held mine, steady, waiting. Slowly, I flipped the cover open. Inside lay a will my grandfather's. His handwriting, shaky but still recognizable in the signature line, leapt off the page like a voice reaching through time. My eyes scanned the text, the words swimming until they landed on the line that shifted everything. To my granddaughter Evelyn Carter, I leave. The air thinned. My throat closed. This wasn't a mistake, not a clerical oversight. It was real, legal, binding, and it had been hidden from me. Why am I only seeing this now? My voice cracked. Half whisper, half accusation. Richard leaned back, his jaw tight. Because your mother made sure of it. She never filed this, kept it buried. The assets weren't massive, but they were yours money and a small parcel of land. Enough to give you a start, enough to matter. My chest ached with a strange mix of grief and fury. I thought of the nights I worked double shifts, of the tuition stolen, of every sneer at family gatherings. And all this time, a piece of my grandfather's legacy had been deliberately stolen from me too. Richard's voice softened. You deserve to know, and if you want, justice can still be restored. It won't be simple, but the law is on your side. I pressed my hands to my face, tears breaking free, but they weren't the weak, collapsing kind I'd shed years ago. These were sharper, brimming with a fierce clarity. When I lowered my hands, the folder still sat before me, its edges solid, undeniable. My fingers gripped it tight, as though it might disappear if I let go. For a long moment, I just sat there, breathing through the storm in my chest. Richard said nothing, letting me anchor myself. Finally, I looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no smile on my lips, but something harder, steadier, the curve of resolve. "Thank you," I whispered. Richard nodded once. Then, almost reluctantly, he pulled open a drawer and withdrew another envelope, heavier, sealed tight. He placed it in front of me, his expression unreadable. "And there's more you should know. This deed, once signed, will bear your name." The notary's voice was calm, almost mechanical, but to me the words rang with the resonance of a prophecy. The office smelled faintly of ink and polished wood, the air sharp with the faint chill of late November seeping through the windows. Outside, Boston's streets were alive with the bustle of Friday morning, but in this quiet room, the world had narrowed to a single piece of paper on the desk before me. I held the pen in my hand, its weight absurdly heavy for something so ordinary. My fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the force of everything that had led me here, the years of saving in silence, the nights of exhaustion, the ridicule endured at every holiday table. This was the culmination, the proof that all of it had been leading to something solid. Richard stood at my shoulder, steady as ever. "Take your time," he said, his voice low, grounding. "It's yours. You've earned this." The notary cleared his throat, tapping the edge of the document. "Signature here, initials here, and here. Date at the bottom." I bent over the paper, the pen poised above the line bearing my name. For a second, my mind flickered with the image of my mother's smirk, the sound of Daniel's laugh when he dismissed me in front of everyone. My hand steadied. I wrote each letter, slowly, deliberately, until my name stretched across the page in full. The notary took the document back, examined it, then pressed his seal down with a loud, echoing thump. Richard's words followed. "By next week, it will be official." The sound reverberated through me like the strike of a gavel in a courtroom, a declaration of justice long delayed, but finally realized. I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and leaned back in the chair. Richard's eyes softened as he studied me. "You're ready for them now," he said. "I'm more than ready," I replied. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. On the train ride home, the deed folder pressed firmly against my chest. I began rehearsing what I might say when the moment arrived. Words formed and reformed in my head, sharp phrases layered with restraint. I pictured the faces around the table, the hush that would fall when the truth landed, the silence that would replace their laughter. At home, I stood in front of the mirror, practicing. "I bought this myself. No, too plain. Next time you mock me, remember this deed. Stronger, sharper, closer to the truth." I tried again and again, testing the cadence, the rhythm, until the words carried the weight I wanted them to. I imagined their gasps, their disbelief, my mother's frozen expression as her smirk dissolved. The hours slipped by as I paced, muttering lines to my reflection, holding the papers as though they were a shield and a sword both. Every scenario I painted ended the same way, with dignity, with proof, with the kind of silence that comes when arrogance collapses under the weight of fact. My phone buzzed just as the evening settled in. I glanced at the screen, my mother's name flashing. A text message appeared, terse and final. "Be here Sunday, or don't bother calling yourself family." I stared at the words for a long moment, then slid the phone down on the table beside the deed. My lips curved into a quiet smile. The stage was set. "Evelyn, why do you still rent that cramped apartment while Daniel owns 2 homes?" The question floated across the dining table, wrapped in my mother's practiced smile, but sharpened to pierce. The smaller pre-Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be casual, just a few relatives gathered, a rehearsal before the grand performance on Sunday. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic mashed potatoes clung to the air, the clinking of silverware punctuating each exchange. But I could feel it before she even spoke. The inevitability of my place in this ritual humiliation. Aunt Clara chuckled, leaning closer to admire Daniel's watch glinting under the light. "He's done so well, Margaret. 2 houses before 40, that's impressive." Margaret's eyes gleamed, pride swelling as she patted Daniel's arm. "Yes, he's always been the ambitious one. Smart with his money, smart with his choices." She let the pause linger, letting everyone bask in Daniel's glow before her gaze slid toward me. "Some people just never figure it out." Daniel leaned back, sipping his wine with deliberate leisure. "Credit scores don't build themselves," he said with mock sympathy. "I mean, even if she had a down payment, which I doubt, no bank would touch her." Laughter buzzed faintly at the edges of the table. The kind of chuckles that weren't loud but cut deeply nonetheless. I kept my expression calm, chewing slowly, the food tasteless against the rising bitterness in my mouth. Inside, my mind was sharper, colder than my demeanor betrayed. They thought their words chipped away at me. In truth, they only carved my resolve deeper. I let my eyes drift across the table, studying them as though from a distance. My mother, basking in her role as matriarch, Daniel, playing the favored son with ease, the others, eager not to challenge the hierarchy, content to ride along with the tide of ridicule. It was all so predictable, every smile rehearsed, every jab as familiar as an old tune. Still, the sting came, as it always did. Margaret tilted her head, her voice carrying just enough volume to be sure every relative heard. At 35, Evelyn, don't you think it's time you stopped throwing money away? Honestly, what do you have to show for yourself? I folded my napkin carefully, smoothing it across my lap, forcing my breathing to remain even. My silence unsettled Daniel. I caught the flicker of irritation in his smirk when I didn't rise to the bait. He leaned forward. Maybe she's waiting for a fairy godmother, or a lottery ticket. He grinned. Though even then, she'd probably misplace it. The laughter rose again, a chorus that washed over me like cold water. I kept my gaze steady, my voice locked inside. My thoughts, however, were unflinching. You'll choke on those words soon enough. Margaret's hand slammed onto the table, the sound startling even the cousins who had been distracted by their phones. You'll never make it, Evelyn. Accept it. Her voice cracked like a gavel, final and merciless. The room fell silent, everyone waiting to see if I'd break. But I didn't. I lifted my glass, sipping slowly, my expression unreadable. Beneath the table, my foot tapped with contained energy, the beat of a countdown only I could hear. I leaned back slightly, my lips curving into the faintest of smiles, so subtle no one noticed. 3 days. That was all it would take for their certainty to crumble, for every sneer and smirk to collapse under the weight of truth. I whispered into the rim of my glass, the words barely audible even to myself. 3 days, Mother, just 3 days. What's in the bag, Evelyn? Looks heavy. His voice came from just behind me, sharp enough to cut through the polite chatter spilling out from the dining room. I froze mid-step, fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. The hallway smelled faintly of roasted chicken and polished wood, but all I noticed was Daniel's shadow stretching long across the floor, a predator's silhouette cast by the chandelier's light. I turned slowly, forcing my expression into calm neutrality. Daniel leaned against the doorway, glass of wine dangling carelessly in one hand, but his eyes weren't lazy. They were narrow, calculating, fixed on the bag I held close to my side. Just work stuff, I said lightly, shifting the strap higher onto my shoulder. My tone was casual, but my pulse betrayed me, beating a staccato rhythm against my ribs. Inside that leather bag lay everything, documents, deeds, the culmination of years of hidden effort. The idea of him prying it open here, in the middle of the house, was enough to set a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. Daniel took a step closer, the hardwood creaking under his shoes. Work stuff, huh? He reached out suddenly, fingers closing around the strap, tugging. Since when do you carry work to family dinners? Seems unlike you. My grip tightened instantly. I yanked the bag back with more force than I intended, the motion jolting my shoulder. For a split second, his strength met mine, and the strap went taut between us like a live wire. The papers inside shifted, rustling softly, the sound roaring in my ears. I forced a laugh, brittle but steady enough to pass. Daniel, don't be ridiculous. It's just paperwork. I didn't think I'd need to defend a handbag at a family dinner. His grip lingered a moment too long, then slipped away. He studied me with narrowed eyes, lips curling in that half-smile he wore when he thought he'd cornered someone. You're awfully protective of it, almost like you're hiding something. I tilted my head, keeping my voice light though my jaw ached from restraint. Not everything in life is a conspiracy. Some of us just like our privacy. He didn't answer immediately, just swirled his wine and took a slow sip, gaze never leaving my face. His silence pressed against me harder than any insult. Finally, he muttered, I'll figure you out. The words slithered into the quiet space between us, half threat, half promise. My stomach twisted, but I held his gaze with a faint smile, not daring to blink. If I looked away, it would be a surrender. When he finally turned back toward the dining room, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hand trembled slightly as I adjusted the strap again, pulling the bag flush against my body like armor. Inside, the papers seemed to pulse with importance, every corner a secret waiting for its moment. Not yet, I told myself, gripping the leather tight. Not until it's time. Behind me, Daniel's footsteps faded into the laughter and conversation, but I could still feel his suspicion coiling in the air. He thought he'd caught a glimpse of something, and he wasn't going to let it go. She's hiding something, and I'll find it. Margaret Carter never filed this will. The words landed with the gravity of a hammer blow, even though Richard's voice was measured, calm, almost professional. The probate records office was quiet except for the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the distant patter of rain against the tall windows. Rows of file cabinets stretched endlessly, their metal drawers labeled with fading stickers. The air smelled of old paper and damp wool from wet coats, and my palms were clammy as I followed Richard down the narrow aisle. I hadn't wanted to believe him back in his office when he first hinted that something had been buried. But now, as we stood in Suffolk County's archives on a rainy Boston afternoon, disbelief gave way to dread. The clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, slid the file across the counter, his eyes indifferent. To him, it was just another piece of paper. To me, it was the severed link between my past and what should have been my future. Richard opened the folder and smoothed the pages. His finger tapped once against the legal header, then against the line where my grandfather's signature trembled at the bottom. My eyes scanned the text, the words swimming, until I landed on the one sentence that cut through everything else. To my granddaughter, Evelyn Carter, I leave the savings account in her name, as well as the parcel of land adjoining the family home. I inhaled sharply, the sound echoing louder than I meant. My knees weakened, and I had to grip the edge of the counter. It was real. It had always been real. He had thought of me, cared enough to secure something in my name, and she had stolen it. She never filed it, Richard said again, his tone heavier this time. Legally, it means those assets slipped through the cracks, and your mother knew exactly what she was doing. I pressed my hand to my mouth, staring down at the ink that proved what I had long suspected, that Margaret's favoritism wasn't just cruel words or biased attention. It was theft, deliberate and absolute. She stole even what my grandfather left me, I whispered, the words trembling as they left my lips. My fingers gripped the paper so tightly that it wrinkled under the pressure. Tears burned behind my eyes, but they didn't fall. They stayed sharp, like shards of glass, fueling something harder than grief. Richard's eyes softened, but his voice carried resolve. This is leverage, Evelyn. You're not powerless. The law remembers even when people try to bury it. On Sunday, we'll reveal it all. Sometimes silence means strength, not weakness. I said it just loud enough for Mother to hear. The words slipped out like smoke, casual on the surface but calculated beneath. And for the first time in years, she didn't immediately have a retort. We were sitting in the corner booth of a small cafe after running errands together, an obligatory coffee stop that had been less about rest and more about giving her another stage. The clink of porcelain cups and low murmur of other patrons filled the air, but my sentence seemed to cut through everything. Margaret had been needling me since we sat down, her tone dripping with the same mixture of superiority and condescension she'd perfected long ago. Really, Evelyn, at your age you should be thinking about stability. A home, a family, something respectable. Instead, you just drift. Daniel has investments, he has assets. What will you ever have? Daniel, seated beside her with the posture of a king at court, chuckled into his latte. Maybe she'll surprise us with a magic trick. Poof House appears out of thin air. He winked at our mother, both of them savoring the amusement. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the spoon tap the ceramic rhythmically. For years I had been the silent audience to their duet of scorn, swallowing words that might have only fed their laughter. But now, the deed weighed in my bag at my feet, the will folded carefully in its envelope, and I no longer felt like a shadow. My silence wasn't empty anymore, it was full, brimming with timing, with power. So I said it, low but clear, every syllable measured. Sometimes silence means strength, not weakness. For a flicker of a moment, Margaret froze, her hand, mid-gesture, stilled above her cup. It was so subtle I doubted anyone else noticed, but I did, a hairline crack in her armor, just for a second. Then she recovered, smoothing her features into practiced disdain. Don't be dramatic, dear. You've confused passivity for wisdom. But her eyes betrayed her just a flicker of uncertainty, quickly hidden. Daniel, sharper than he looked, caught it. He leaned forward, studying me with narrowed eyes. What's that supposed to mean, Ev? His voice wasn't mocking now. It was probing, searching for a hint of the secret he suspected I carried. I met his gaze briefly, then looked away, as though dismissing the question. My calm expression was deliberate, though inside my heart pounded hard enough that I feared they might hear it. Margaret reached for her bag, clearly eager to move the conversation along, but Daniel's stare lingered on me, heavy, unrelenting. He wanted answers, and for the first time, he wasn't laughing. I let a faint smile tug at my lips as I sipped my coffee, disguising the adrenaline running hot through my veins. The silence that followed was mine this time, not theirs. They'll remember that line. Boston glowed with holiday lights, but I saw only one thing: the fire I would unleash tomorrow. The streets shimmered with strands of gold and red strung across shop fronts, wreaths hanging heavy on doors, and children tugging at mittened hands to stop at candy displays. Couples laughed, their voices rising above the hiss of tires on wet pavement. The world was dressed in celebration, but I walked through it with my bag pressed close to my side, each step echoing with years of humiliation replaying in my head. For them, tomorrow meant turkey, family, and gratitude. For me, it meant reckoning. I passed a storefront window, catching my reflection in the glass. 35 years old, hair damp from mist, coat clutched tight. To anyone else, I looked like another weary commuter. But behind my eyes, a storm raged, every smirk, every dismissal, every theft of my dignity fueling the fire that now burned steady, ready to ignite. My phone buzzed. Richard's name lit the screen. I stepped beneath an awning, the rain tapping a steady rhythm above me as I answered. His voice was calm, grounding, as always. Everything is set. I'll be there tomorrow at 6 sharp. Bring the documents, I said, my voice lower than I intended. They're ready, he assured me. A pause. Softer now. Are you? I glanced down at my bag, the folder inside pressed against the fabric like a heartbeat. I've been ready for 10 years, I whispered. We ended the call, and I continued down the street, the festive lights blurring in the drizzle. By the time I reached my apartment, the city's cheer had given way to silence. My small space smelled faintly of old wood and lavender detergent. I hung my coat, set my bag on the kitchen table, and unlatched the clasp. One by one, I laid the documents out: the deed with its embossed stamp, the will in its crisp envelope, proof, weapons, justice bound in paper. I stood in front of the mirror, the glass fogged slightly from the radiator's heat. My reflection met my stare, tired but unflinching. I practiced the words over and over, testing their weight on my tongue. I bought this myself. Too flat. This deed is mine. Stronger, but not sharp enough. Finally, tomorrow, I reclaim everything they stole. That line rang true. It carried the years of silence, the ache of betrayal, and the promise of reversal. I repeated it again, watching my lips form the syllables until they carved themselves into my memory. My voice trembled at first, but steadied with each attempt, until it came out like steel. When I finally slipped the documents back into the bag and fastened the clasp, my heart slowed to a steady rhythm. The countdown had reached its final hours. Across town, in a house that smelled of polished oak and expensive wine, Margaret poured herself another glass as Daniel lounged beside her. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. Tomorrow, she said, a smile curving her lips, we'll put her in her place once and for all. Tonight, every eye in this room will see what they never believed. The thought pulsed in my chest as I stood at the threshold of Margaret Carter's dining room, the scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and wine clinging thick in the air. The table stretched long beneath the chandelier's glow, polished silver gleaming, crystal glasses lined like soldiers waiting for a command. Every seat was filled uncles with ruddy cheeks already flushed from drink, aunts with pearls catching the light, cousins whispering and smirking. At the far end, Margaret presided like a queen, Daniel her proud heir. I slid into my chair, my bag tucked discreetly at my feet. Richard sat 2 places down, his presence explained away as an old family friend. He kept his face composed, but I caught the flicker of readiness in his eyes when they met mine. The conversation bubbled over like champagne. Praise flowed easily in Daniel's direction. 2 houses already? Incredible. Such a sharp investor. Your mother must be proud. He basked in it, leaning back with casual arrogance, his laughter carrying like the ring of a bell. Margaret's smile was all satisfaction. Daniel has always had the drive, she said loudly, making sure the words reached every corner of the room. Then, with a pointed glance at me, her tone turned sweetly poisonous. Unlike some people who seem to prefer a permanent rental life, a ripple of amusement circled the table. My cousins chuckled. An aunt hid her smirk behind her glass. I let their laughter wash over me, keeping my expression serene. Inside, though, my narration was sharp as a blade. Every word you say tonight will come back to you, Mother. Every sneer will be measured against the silence that follows. Daniel raised his glass, grinning. Don't worry, Ev. Maybe one day you'll catch up. His voice was easy, confident, but his eyes searched me as though he sensed something beneath my calm exterior. I let the moment stretch, answering only with a polite smile that revealed nothing. The tension thickened, invisible but palpable, winding itself around every exchange. It was a stage, and each of them played their part without realizing the script had already been rewritten. Margaret leaned forward, glass of red wine gleaming like liquid fire in her hand. She lifted it high, her voice commanding silence. "Let's be thankful," she declared, her tone rich with authority. Then, with the smirk I had known all my life, she added, "Except some of us will never know what success means." The room hushed. A few chuckles slipped through, but mostly eyes darted toward me, waiting for the usual quiet endurance, the shrinking figure I had always been. Instead, I glanced sideways at Richard. His hand rested casually near his glass, his expression neutral, but when his eyes met mine, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The signal. The storm had gathered. Tomorrow's fire was no longer tomorrow, it was here, simmering, ready to consume. "Face it, Evelyn. You'll never own anything worth showing." Her words cut across the table with the sharpness of a blade, the smug curve of her lips daring me to reply. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her glass tilted casually in her hand, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of the predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. Around us, the hum of conversation faltered, relatives exchanging glances, whispers threading through the air like smoke. It was almost identical to that first humiliation, years ago, her voice rising above the din, forcing the spotlight onto me, my silence turning me into the evening's entertainment. But this time I felt the difference, not in her tone, not in the laughter that rippled out after her declaration, but in me. My heart still pounded, yes, but not with the helplessness I'd once carried. Now it beat with the weight of documents sealed in my bag, with the knowledge of truths waiting to be unleashed. Daniel chuckled, always eager to play his part. He swirled the wine in his glass and added, "Even if she tried, banks would laugh her out the door." Can you imagine Evelyn Carter applying for a mortgage? He grinned around the table, encouraging others to laugh with him. They'd frame her application as a joke. The laughter came again, small and mean. Some tilted their heads with mock pity, as though my life were a cautionary tale. Others sneered, the way people do when cruelty costs them nothing. Every eye turned toward me, waiting for my cheeks to flush, for me to shrink back, for me to play the role they knew so well. I let them think they were right. I sipped my wine, slow and measured, the crimson liquid catching the light. Their voices pressed down, but instead of burying me, the weight steadied me. I looked at Margaret's face, Daniel's smirk, the aunts and uncles craning forward as if feeding on scraps. They thought they were at the peak of their power, that I had no defense. Margaret leaned forward again, her voice syrupy sweet, urging the others. "Go on, laugh. She needs to hear it. Maybe then she'll stop dreaming and accept reality." The laughter swelled once more, and my stillness only fed it. But inside, my silence was alive, thrumming with the anticipation of the moment I had crafted for years. I placed my glass back onto the table, the sound deliberate, a soft clink that carried more weight than the volume of their voices. My hand was steady as I pushed the stem away from me. I straightened, my gaze sweeping across the table. When I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, but sharper than any of their barbs. "Is everyone listening?" The laughter cut off abruptly, the shift in the room almost audible. Heads turned fully toward me now, not with amusement, but with a flicker of uncertainty. Margaret's smirk faltered, her hand pausing mid-gesture. Daniel frowned, caught off guard by the clarity in my tone. Richard, seated quietly at the side, set his napkin down and rose smoothly to his feet. His voice carried over the silence, polished and commanding. "Excuse me, I believe you've all overlooked something. This property deed is registered under Evelyn Carter." Richard's voice landed like thunder in the still room. For a moment, no one moved. The laughter that had filled the dining hall seconds before died in mid-breath, The sound clipped off as though someone had severed the strings. The chandelier's light gleamed against polished wood, against glasses of untouched wine, but the air was frozen. Every gaze pivoted toward me. Richard slid the stamped, notarized documents onto the linen-covered table, the embossed seal catching the glow. The papers lay heavy, undeniable, a kind of proof that silenced every mocking word they had hurled at me over the years. Gasps scattered around the table, uncles leaning forward, cousins craning their necks. Margaret's smirk faltered, her lips twitching as though trying to hold onto their familiar curve but failing. The color drained from her face as her eyes darted to Daniel, who stared at the papers as though they were written in a language he couldn't read. The silence was thick, suffocating. And then, slowly, deliberately, I rose from my chair. My palms rested flat against the tablecloth, my body steady, my voice calm but cutting through the room with the sharpness of a blade. I earned this. No bank, no man, no mother gave it to me. The words rang louder than any shout. I watched them hit, watched relatives glance at each other, whispers buzzing just under their breath. The smug certainty that had defined every family gathering cracked open in real time, disbelief spilling through the fractures. Daniel pushed back in his chair, stammering, You can't be serious. This is some trick." But his voice lacked the force it once carried. The certainty had bled out of him. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wineglass, but she didn't drink. This isn't what it looks like?" The excuse was weak, unconvincing even to her own ears. I leaned forward, letting my words slice through her denial. 10 years ago you stole my future. Tonight, I take it back." The line hung in the air like a sentence handed down in a courtroom. I saw the memory flash across Margaret's face, my tuition funds stripped away, her cold justification that Daniel needed it more. For the first time, she had nothing to answer with. The table buzzed with uneasy energy, half shock, half recognition. The weight of truth had shifted, and for once it pressed down on them instead of me. Richard cleared his throat gently, his hand reaching into the folder once more. He pulled out another sealed envelope, heavier, the edges crisp with age. He placed it deliberately beside the deed, his expression grave. "And there is one more matter, the hidden will." Margaret Carter secretly concealed her father's will. Richard's voice carried through the dining room like the toll of a heavy bell. The laughter and whispers that had been smothered by the property deed revelation now fell into utter silence. Every fork, every glass, every hand around the table stilled. My mother's name, her authority, her reputation hung in the air, suddenly weighted with suspicion. Richard laid the envelope flat on the table, his movements deliberate. The room seemed to shrink as he unfolded the paper and slid the yellowed document free. The seal was still intact, the ink faintly smudged but unmistakable. He positioned it so everyone could see the heading, Last Will and Testament. My heart pounded as he turned to me, his voice steady. "Your grandfather left this in your name, Evelyn. His savings account. A parcel of land. Enough to secure your start in life. He wanted you to have it." The words struck like a hammer blow against the silence. Aunts gasped. Uncles muttered, leaning closer, their voices tight with outrage. Cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers rippling like fire along dry grass. She hid it? All these years? How could she? Margaret's face drained of color, her hand trembling against the stem of her glass. She shook her head, her lips parting and closing again, as if words might form, but none came. Daniel's eyes flicked to the paper, then to me. He frowned, confusion replacing arrogance. For once, he wasn't smirking. "Wait, she never told me that." His voice cracked, less defiant than wounded. "All those years, you told me we had nothing left, you said." He stopped, realization dawning. His anger redirected not at me, but at the woman who had orchestrated everything. The betrayal was no longer mine alone. He was beginning to understand the scale of her manipulation, how she had twisted him into both pawn and shield. Margaret finally found her voice, though it shook. "I only did what was best for the family." The line was weak, desperate. The relatives erupted, voices rising in outrage. "Best for the family? You robbed her. How could you steal from your own daughter? What else have you hidden?" Margaret's eyes darted from face to face, searching for loyalty, but none came. Even Daniel recoiled, his jaw tight, betrayal carving deep lines across his features. I leaned forward, my gaze locking on hers. The years of silence now hardened into steel. My voice cut through the noise with surgical precision. No, you did what was best for Daniel, and you crushed me. For the first time, I walked out lighter than when I walked in. The dining room behind me was a wreck of silence and shattered pride. No one called my name, no one dared stop me. Relatives who had once delighted in my humiliation kept their eyes fixed on their plates, unwilling to meet my gaze. Margaret sat stiff, her glass untouched, her lips pressed tight, the power drained from her face. Daniel slumped in his chair, shoulders hunched as though he had aged years in an hour, his certainty burned away. I didn't need to look back to know they would never see me the same again. Richard walked beside me, his steady presence as grounding as the chill November air that hit my face when the front door closed behind us. The night was alive with holiday lights strung across Boston streets, their colors reflecting off wet pavement. I inhaled deeply, the cold sharp in my lungs, and for once the air didn't feel heavy, it felt like release. Neither of us spoke at first. Our footsteps echoed together, the sound of freedom in unison. Finally, Richard broke the silence. You won tonight. His voice was low, steady, not celebratory, but certain, like a verdict pronounced. I shook my head, clutching my bag closer, the edges of the documents pressing firm against my side. No, I said, my voice firm, clear. Justice won. We walked on, past shop windows glowing with warmth, past the laughter of strangers spilling from doorways. None of it touched me. None of it mattered. What mattered was the weight that had finally lifted, the years of being dismissed and silenced collapsing behind me. When we reached the quiet street where my new house stood, I paused at the gate. The house loomed in the dark, not grand, not ostentatious, but mine. Lights glowed softly from within, casting a golden hue against the porch. I pulled the keys from my pocket, their cold metal biting against my palm. For a moment I held them tight, remembering every sacrifice. Every night I lay awake planning, saving, waiting. Richard stopped a step behind me, letting me face it alone. I climbed the porch slowly, each step deliberate. My hand trembled as I fit the key into the lock, the sound of metal turning echoing like a final gavel in a trial long overdue. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was warm, faintly scented with new paint and wood polish. Empty rooms waited, silent, but filled with promise. I closed the door behind me, pressing my back against it for a moment, the weight of victory settling into my bones. This is mine, I whispered into the quiet, my voice breaking, then steadying into steel. At last, I moved to the window, the light from the street spilling in, and looked out into the night. The city shimmered back at me, and for the first time in my life, I felt not like an outsider looking in but someone who belonged, someone who had built her own place in the world. I glanced upward at the lit window above, imagining it filled with the life I would shape from here, a soft hint at beginnings not yet written. The night stretched wide before me, and I let it. The long silence of humiliation ended in a single night, when lies crumbled and truth stood unshaken. What began as years of betrayal and stolen chances transformed into a reckoning that no smirk or taunt could survive. Justice, though delayed, proved sharper than pride when injustice is met with unwavering courage. The final verdict can echo through a lifetime. Sometimes it takes only one brave stand to turn suffering into freedom, reminding us that no wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Type 1 if you feel connected, or type 2 if you think it still falls short.